we've been campaigning for 60 years now to see this change take place. And it really started after the Second World War, because the clocks were put forward during the war to save energy and to optimise daylight. And then, for some reason which no one was able to explain, they were put back at the end of the war. You know, it's like returning to normal. Why wouldn't you want to save energy in daylight after the war if you've been saving it during the war? So we started to see an increase in the number of casualties on the roads. We believe they were daylight related, and our analysis showed that we would save a lot of lives if we moved the clocks forward by an hour throughout the whole period of the year, so move on to the SDST system. The 1968-71 experiment came about largely as the result of some of the lobbying that we did to see what the effects would be, and that proved conclusively that there were a large number of lives to be saved and injuries to be prevented by making this change. Unfortunately, data gathering was so slow in those days that it wasn't until 1973 that we got the final figures from that experiment, which proved conclusively the case. But by that time, Parliament had already agreed to finish the experiment, and by the time the case was made then, it was too late. We had to go back to square one, and that's where we've been ever since, up until Rebecca Harris's private members bill, which is going through the House of Commons at the moment and is making very good progress, and we hope will show us the way, because unlike previous bills which have asked for a change in the regime for a 3-year experiment, this bill is asking for an analysis of the benefits to be done by every government department. So no one's saying they're going to make the change. What we're just going to do is gather the data definitively, one way or the other, as to whether this would be a good change or not. And we feel very strongly, those of us involved in this campaign, that it will be a very positive outcome should that bill go through.
You mentioned the SDST. Can you explain that in slightly more detail, how it would work?
Well, in the winter we're on GMT, Greenwich Mean Time, and then in the summer we go into GMT+1, which we call British Summer Time. The regime that we're advocating advances the clocks by 1 hour for both of those hours. So during the winter we'd be on GMT+1, and during the summer we'd be on GMT+2. So basically the whole thing would move 1 hour forward. But we'd still put the clocks back and forward because, you know, we need to do that to optimise the daylight. But it would be 1 hour ahead of where we currently do it, and that would make a much better use of daylight. It would take an hour from the morning, where we need it less, and put it into the evening, where we need it more. And from a road safety perspective, if I could just go on to explain that, the largest number of casualties typically occur in the evening peak rush hour. There are quite obviously casualties in the morning rush hour as well, but they're not as great in number as they are in the evening peak hour. So what we need to do is to shine some light literally on the evening peak. And in order to do that, we have to take away a little bit of the daylight from the morning peak. So we probably would see a slight increase in casualties in the morning, but a very significant decrease of casualties in the evening peak. And the net benefit for the UK would be 80 lives saved every year, 200 serious injuries prevented, and that's a very big road safety gain in one fell swoop for something which doesn't cost anything.
I gather you also think there will be an economic and an environmental benefit to this.
Yes, I mean there are many potential economic benefits. I mean, obviously we would harmonise with Europe, which would make our export activities a little bit easier. The main gain which comes from industry seems to be around tourism, and the tourism industry have calculated that it would create 60,000 jobs, £3.5 billion extra going into the economy, and my goodness, we could really do with those two wonderful opportunities right now. And of course this would be done largely because we'd be able to have lighter evenings about a month earlier and a month later during the year, and this would increase the size and shape of the tourism market quite significantly in the UK. On the environmental side, this has been a relatively quiet argument up until recently, but in 2007 Cambridge University carried out the first really good analysis of what the benefits would be of making this change, and those figures are updated in 2009. In simple terms, we would say that about 450,000 tonnes of carbon every year in the UK. We would cut our electricity costs, because obviously we'd be using less electricity, so that would save us money. The savings in environmental terms are equivalent to 85% of all the renewable energy that is currently generated. So If you think about all the disputes and all the trouble that's been caused over setting up wind farms, that sort of thing, all over the UK, well, we could have achieved 85% of that result just by making this change. And it's just there for the grabbing if we take it. And what this means in practical terms is that's enough electricity to power pretty much Edinburgh or 2/3 of Glasgow. So that's a fantastic gain to be made in environmental terms, and obviously in the cost benefits which come with reducing our electricity consumption. So very powerful argument there too.
Interesting that you mentioned two Scottish cities, because obviously there is a Scottish question, isn't there? There is the notion that in the depths of winter it won't be daylight in Scotland until well after 9:30 in the morning.
That's true.
How do you respond to that issue?
I mean, we can't give people anywhere in the UK more daylight. What we can do is distribute it in a way that suits the most people in the most positive way. It's interesting that in the 1968-71 experiment, there was a great deal of negative publicity about the fact that children were being hurt in the mornings, in the dark mornings on the way to school. There was never any publicity at all about the fact that many fewer children were being hurt in the evenings on their way home from school. So when both of these sides of the argument are put, it is clear that you will save children's lives in Scotland, as in anywhere else, if you make this change. So why wouldn't you do it? But there's another factor as far as the road safety argument is concerned, and that is the more northerly you go, the less daylight you have in the winter, the more the effect you see of these two peaks. So in fact there are more casualties in Scotland in the two peaks, and this change would reduce them more than it would reduce them in England and Wales. So if we look at the 1968-71 experiment again, during the hours in question, the number of casualties in England and Wales decreased by 11% during the course of the experiment. In Scotland, they decreased by 17%. So that's just a simple fact that Scottish people have to have darker days because there's less daylight, and if you can shine more light on their evening rush hour, then the morning rush hour, you will obviously save more lives there because there are more casualties because it is darker, longer in the winter. So contrary to what is said, the gains in Scotland are actually greater than they would be in England and Wales.
Because at the moment Scottish MPs do say, or some of them at least say, they will oppose it, don't they?
There's a very strong lobby against this in Scotland. A lot of it is based on the prejudice that I mentioned, that only the morning casualties were reported during the experiment. We have to be honest and say that this is a political issue in Scotland. It's not about the facts and figures alone, because if it was, then I think the argument would be won, because this benefits Scotland more than it does anybody else. The argument in Scotland is about politics. And there's a very great feeling in Scotland which needs to be overcome by explanation and argument and discourse, that it's somehow the English trying to impose a change on Scotland. And I just don't think that that is the right mindset to have. If Scottish people realised how much more beneficial this would be for them than it would be for those who live in England and Wales, they would conversely be clamouring for the change and demanding that England make the change rather than complaining that England's about to impose it upon them. This bill, I think, really very importantly, isn't going to change the law, isn't going to change the clocks. What it is going to do is force a proper formal review of the costs and benefits of doing so. So I hope this bill gets through, because we want to know what the facts are. And believe me, if the statistics showed that this would increase the number of casualties on the road, then we would not be supporting it. But because they so clearly proved that it would decrease the number of casualties, that is why we at RoSPA are very much in favour of it. And we feel that if this study takes place at Whitehall level, and government departments are required formally to analyse the issues and to produce a report, then they will all find very great difficulty in finding anything to say against this measure. And that in turn will then lead to the logical trial for 3 years, we hope, which will again prove practically the point, and then we can move on to the new regime. And I may be wrong, but I predict that in that event, there won't be any lobbying and campaigning to go back to the old system. No one is going to hang in there for 60 years trying to get us to go back to where we are now in a few years' time, rather like we have been trying for 60 years to go forward. They won't be trying to go backwards because there's not really any case. there has never been any piece of competent research done by any organisation to show that this would be a bad thing for England, Wales, Scotland, or any part of the UK. All the evidence points in the direction of it bringing many benefits on all sorts of different levels. We've talked about the environment, we've talked about the business case from the tourism industry. The road safety case is very clear, very hard to dispute that one. It's the quality of life. What is it so much better in your life to have an hour of daylight in the evening when you finish work, when you've come home from school, that you can go out with your friends, or you can go and kick a football. We want our kids to be active and healthy. Well, if they're living in darkness in the evenings, it's very hard for them to be. But if we give them some more daylight in their free time, that's a very good way of improving their lives. Older people are curfewed by the dark. If we could have the evening darkness onset later, that would give them an extra hour when they can be out and about, they can be visiting their friends, they can be enjoying their quality of life. They can also be taking exercise, and that in turn is a very good thing for their longevity and for their good health. We've got obesity problems, we've got heart problems, and all these other health problems that are going on. Well, they're all helped by having exercise. And what's one easy way to improve your opportunity for exercise? Well, to give yourself some daylight during the hours when you could do so. So that's one of the other factors. So there are many other issues, but I think just touching on the principal ones, you can see that there are overwhelming arguments in favour of at least finding out what the facts are, and at least carrying out an experiment. There are people who will feel disadvantaged by this. There are some workers, some groups who will say that they don't want to start work in darker mornings. I can understand.
The farming community being
well,
one.
Some people in the farming community, but farming practices have changed a lot since the experiment in 68-71. A lot of livestock are kept indoors anyway, so it really doesn't make a lot of difference for those farmers. The argument amongst the farming community is shifting more towards this change. It's certainly not against it. I'd say it's neutral to positive, with my reading of the current situation. Yeah, and there are other workers like those in the waste industry who start very early and so on, and they would say, well, this would be a disadvantage for me. Well, maybe that's true, but if you ask someone one-to-one, look, would you suffer a little bit of inconvenience, and for that you would help to save the life of another person? If you ask people that question one-to-one, they will almost invariably answer, yes, I will. I will give up my little bit of freedom or little bit of inconvenience. I'll accept that in order to help someone else to live. And surely that ultimately is the overriding argument.